Hello everyone, welcome to the Sunset Boulevard lecture for your text response unit in 3 and 4 English. My name's Sienna and I'm really excited to be able to deliver this presentation to you today. So I guess we'll just start off with some nice housekeeping, get it out the way. You guys can ask me any questions in the live chat below. I'm sure you've seen that function when you've clicked the link. And you can also download this presentation and check out some of our other resources that might be helpful for you. I've also highlighted some key English vocab words that you guys might like to pick up on in blue throughout this presentation. They might be useful for you, and some key quotes are also evident in yellow highlighting as well. But perfect. These are the topics that we'll be covering today, just a brief overview. So in case you haven't read the text, we are going to go through a plot summary. We'll look at kind of a big picture and also a scene-by-scene breakdown of what happens throughout the film in Sunset Boulevard. And then we'll look into kind of my interpretation and the background into the film. This can often help with some authorial intent and the purpose behind some of the things that Wilder maybe does. So I think it's a good section to go over. And then we'll take a look at some character and theme analysis, look kind of deeper into those overarching themes and the characters and their beliefs and events that happen throughout the film. We'll look at some language features as well as some essay structure tips and tricks for you guys. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. I guess this is just a bit more of a kind of tip for you guys. I recommend, as with a film, getting a script of the film. You can find a PDF online and annotate that as much as you can. So for your first viewing, when you're actually watching the film, look for that plot, kind of the major characters, just kind of understand what's going on. And then once you watch over it again throughout your second viewing and your third viewing, you can look for some quotes and themes, minor characters, and then tap into those literary devices as well, or film techniques they should be called when addressing a film. As for memorizing quotes, you can do that through getting a script as well. If you find that you want to look up some certain moments but don't know exactly where they are in the film, it might be helpful to just look for keywords throughout the actual script. And you can group them by theme, maybe in a quote chart, or by character. I think Sunset Boulevard can work for both. And we'll go into some of this a bit later, but you should kind of modify your quotes accordingly so that they fit into your paragraphs and that they flow smoothly rather than having 10-word, 20-word chunks of evidence in there. That's not what we like to see. So, for example, you don't have to learn full chunks of the dialogue. You can incorporate it like this sentence I've got as an example here. So, the portrayal of Norma laying on her couch, surrounded by photographs of herself from her silent film era, illuminates her need to be constantly reminded about the, quote, heights of her career. So that's an example as how we can incorporate that as well. And if you do like to have kind of flashcards or something like that, you can also do the look, see, cover, write, check as well technique. And just do that over and over again. Practice makes perfect in English. You can never really write too many essays. That being said, it's good to write with purpose, and consciously try and improve certain things. If you need to work on structure, then consciously try and improve that rather than just writing essays aimlessly. Amazing. So I guess we'll just get straight into the plot summary now. So here's just a little 3-sentence summary for you guys, just to sum it up before we go into a scene-by-scene breakdown. So the film opened with down-and-out screenwriter Joe Gillis floating dead in a swimming pool before he, as the film's narrator, moves to recount the events leading to his demise. Finding himself at the decaying mansion of former silent film star Norma Desmond, Joe becomes increasingly entangled with her delusions and lavish lifestyle. whilst he does eventually realise the destruction in the path he's on and longs for a simple life with Betty. Norma shoots and kills Joe amidst her fit of despair and madness, where the film's ending captures the tragic end to her fantasy, as well as the harsh realities of the film industry and the consequences of fame and obsession. So quite a lot to unpack in those 3 sentences there, but I think it's a good brief overview of the events in the film. And down here we also just have some key ideas in the text, or some of them anyways. We'll be going through a couple of these when we take a look closer at the themes. But just as a brief overview, we have the dangers of fame, freedom and entrapment, isolation, delusion compared to reality, and of course the film noir genre and the techniques that partner that. And we'll take a look at how Wilder uses them to create a certain atmosphere and scene, if you will. Perfect. So just as a brief character summary, we'll go into a bit more detail a bit later. But we have Joe. He is the protagonist and the narrator in Sunset Boulevard. We see him at the beginning, obviously floating dead in the swimming pool. And the film is a recount of the events that led to this. So there is a sense of inevitability throughout the film. You'll probably hear me say that a couple times throughout this lecture. Because we as the viewers know what's going to happen ultimately, that Joe will end up dead, and I guess it's just a matter of how the events lead to that. We do experience some pivotal points in the film that might leave the viewer wondering, oh, maybe Joe will end up all right, but ultimately we do know the ending and it is inevitable from the beginning. But looking at some traits for Joe, he is quite noble, ambitious, and charismatic, looking at some more positives. And if we take a look at some of the more negative aspects of his character, he's quite, I guess his morality is open to interpretation. It's quite ambiguous throughout the film. There is some opportunistic characteristics to him as well. And then if we take a look at Norma, who I guess is second most prominent. She is the former silent film star, and she is ultimately determined to re-obtain her past success in the spotlight of the film industry. So ultimately, she tends to fall into the trap of her own delusions and dreams. So if we look at some positive characteristics for Norma, she is quite charming, successful, and eccentric. And if we look at some more negative aspects of her character, quite melancholic, stubborn, and disillusioned. Feel free to take those words if you think they might be helpful when maybe brainstorming for an essay. But if we take a look at Max, he is the director during Norma's silent film peak, obviously has stuck with her throughout her downfall and to where she is now. And during the present moment of the film, he is her butler, but as later revealed in the film, was actually her first husband as well. And then Betty, finally out of the kind of core four, if you will, she is the fiancée to Joe's best friend Artie, but is also Joe's main love interest almost. There's a bit of a love triangle between Joe, Norma, and Betty, as some of you, if you've watched the film, might have picked out. But as a whole, Betty's character acts as a point of clarity throughout the film. And what I mean by that is a lot of the decisions that characters make, or that Wilder paints them to make, are quite clouded in the judgment. And Betty kind of acts as a clarity point in that regard. She was able to become aware of the illusion of the Hollywood industry quite early on, compared to maybe people like Norma, who are still kind of caught in the trance of like an ephemeral kind of career, if that makes sense. So Betty is kind of that clarity point. She's that clear thinker throughout the film. Perfect. So now just moving on to a scene by scene breakdown. So in the first 3 minutes, we see the film open with a panning shot downwards towards the Sunset Boulevard sign. So this kind of foreshadows the demise that will take place on the street. So one of the first scenes is the street name in the gutter, which I guess kind of contrasts the wider belief that the film industry is quite glamorous. You know, if the street name of a very popular and affluent street is in the gutter, you know, maybe that has a deeper meaning to that. And that can also, I guess, tap into Wilder's moral high ground as well, being higher than the industry at the time. Yeah, so I think that's what that does. And we also see the street sign as well, normally after we've already seen the gutter. So it's kind of like that contrast between the two, what people think and what maybe the deeper meaning or the deeper understanding of the industry kind of tries to hide. Anyways, moving on. We also see the low shot of the palm trees and the police cars. So this, again, kind of adding to the, I guess, awakening and it kind of opposes the glamour of the industry. It juxtaposes the Hollywood industry, kind of says like illusion versus reality, if that makes sense. And then we also open with Joe's narration, talking about himself in the third person as we see him floating in the pool. It's quite a gothic and eerie vibe. So again, adding to that corruption of the Hollywood industry, Wilder really paints that picture throughout the first scene. And then we have the dissolving shot of Joe dying in the pool to where, quote, it all started. And I guess that notes how fast tragedy can progress in Hollywood. So that is that first little scene. This one's a bit more broader now. We're not going to move in 3-minute increments. That would take much longer. But looking at 2:50 to 12 minutes, essentially, Joe asks for $300 from his agent, who declines. We see Joe struggling to maintain his success as a screenwriter. So that's kind of that down and out screenwriter role that he takes on straight away. I think Betty notes him to write trite scripts or scripts with no real quality to them. Joe kind of writes them just to get by. I think he notes it as like B-grade scripts or something. I think that's a quote, the B-grade scripts. So we can see that maybe his effort is not at the same level that maybe it was when he started out in the industry. And I think that kind of links to the overall impression that once you enter Hollywood, fame is everlasting. And I think Wilder definitely debunks that ideology throughout the film. But I think both Joe and Norma, in different aspects, were under that impression. And we can see that both of them struggle with that idea as well, in different ways, of course. But Joe is worried that he'll have to return back to, quote, that $35 a week job at the copy desk of the Dayton Evening Post. So that kind of links to that struggle that he's feeling as well. That's a nice quote to showcase that. And then we move to Sheldrake's office, or we're still in there, where he forgets Betty's name. And this is the first kind of opener, I guess, to the gender roles and how women have to work a bit harder for respect in that industry, especially during that time, despite being in front or behind of the camera. We see that with Norma and Betty respectively, I guess. Norma being in front, Betty being behind, both of them definitely have to, or attempt to work for respect in their role. Norma may be a bit more delusion to it than Betty, but there you go. Joe becomes entangled with the tax collectors / insurance people. I think he calls them bloodhounds, as a bit of an insight to his cynical persona. And he attempts to drive away in his very symbolic car. Kind of ironic too, he drives from one problem just to reach another, because the tire blows out coincidentally right at Norma's house. So I guess that ties to some fate there. And this is kind of the first sign of how his independence maybe fades. Whilst he hasn't developed a relationship with Norma yet, we do see his agency fade throughout the film, and how Norma is definitely dominant in the relationship as well. So, next kind of scene. So the sign that the mansion that Joe has stumbled upon kind of reflects the 1920s mansion. So we see automatically, before even meeting Norma, how maybe she is stuck in the past, reflected upon by her house straight away. And we see the funeral that she's holding for her pet chimp. Joe comes at almost a very, very perfect time to replace that chimp, and is very much Norma's monkey. And by that I mean she can control him, or begins to control him more as the film progresses, which I guess kind of links to his shrinking agency throughout the film. So that's a nice symbol to maybe draw upon. And Joe is mistaken for the coffin person. So once Norma realizes he isn't, she immediately sees an opportunity to take advantage of him. I guess that could be interpreted as Norma taking advantage of Joe the way that the industry took advantage of her. We might touch upon that a little bit more when we're looking deeper into Norma. But that is the kind of linking to the symbolism of the chimp as well. And how Joe comes and replaces that, and a monkey or a chimp is quite easy to manipulate in that regard, I think, which could be what Wilder is trying to imply through that. But Norma tries to get Joe to help her write her script so that she can make it back into the industry. So I guess this kind of shows insight into how she subconsciously knows she's in a part of the industry anymore. But she most definitely refuses to accept the reality of her situation, as evident in more than one scene. This obviously wouldn't be an example. But yeah, she kind of knows that she isn't a part of it. And I think that's also symbolic when she does, I haven't covered it in the breakdown yet, but when she does go to Paramount Studios after her, she thinks she's getting her big break again, and the gates are actually shut. She can't... I guess that's kind of symbolic of her not being a part of the industry anymore. I'll touch on that a bit later. It's a nice symbol to note down. But the gates are closed. The people supervising aren't recognizing her, and those that do are quite... they're the older generation. She's not a part of the current fixation in Hollywood. So I think she tries to convince herself that she is, but I really think deep down she knows that she isn't, and that's what she's really fighting for. She's fighting to get back to the heights of her career, quote. Amazing. So 22 to 32 minutes. Joe agrees to help Norma. Unbeknownst to him, his stuff is all relocated to her mansion while he sleeps. So this is a final indicator, or one of the first indicators, that his independence is slowly going to be disappearing, or is beginning to disappear. I think he thinks that he's in control in the situation, but really, with his agency getting smaller and smaller, just losing control even more, he really isn't, or he loses control. Maybe he controlled it at the beginning, thinking that, getting some quick cash for writing a script for Norma, turns into a much bigger problem for him, whilst he might have seen it as a bit of an out, especially with the insurance people being able to keep his car there, that we obviously see how that ends later. But Joe also asks why Max brought his things, and Max continues to play the piano. He actually doesn't acknowledge Joe in this moment, and I guess this links to Max's character overall. He's very much Norma's protector, or views himself as Norma's protector, and it highlights how he kind of blocks out reality for the betterment of Norma. And by that I mean, we see that he writes her fan letters. I'll cover that a bit later in this slide. And whilst that actually does, I think, increase her delusion, Max wants to keep her happy. And I think, he doesn't have too much dialogue compared to other characters. And I think this moment where he does ignore Joe can kind of... one of the first signs show that he really wants to protect Norma. So moving on, there is a high-angled shot of Norma laying melodramatically, surrounded by photos of herself. Very key moment, I think, when I'm working with students, this is one of the key moments in the film that kind of showcases her self-obsession. The high camera shot in this scene symbolizes how the viewers are higher than her, as well as kind of her desire to regain her status. And what I mean by that is if there's a high-angled camera shot, the camera is above the actor or the scene in that sense. So if the viewers or the camera is higher than Norma, I guess it's symbolic of her trying to regain that status, or that Wilder and the viewers are kind of higher than her status-wise, if that makes sense. Norma finds out Joe's situation and pays off his apartment. Again, moves his belongings but not his car, so he can't leave. I guess we can see, linking back to that, losing control, losing his agency, Norma becoming increasingly dominant and manipulative in the relationship. And Norma doesn't really talk about money too much around Joe, just as a little note, as she wants him to be dependent on her, I guess. And I think Joe makes himself think that he doesn't need a job because of this, but really, some quick cash isn't necessarily a full-time job, is it? And yeah, as I said, Norma reads the fan letters that are actually from Max, not her thousands of fans that she thinks they're from. And I said this a little bit before, I guess this is kind of just not a moment in the scene, but Norma does end up using and abusing Joe to an extent. And I guess that connection, as I've said before, can kind of be drawn to the way that the Hollywood system kind of used her very quickly. You know, when she was great, they loved her. And all of a sudden, when the talkies came along, that's some history in Hollywood, we'll touch on that later, or the films with dialogue came along and the silent film star wasn't necessary, she was kicked out or not needed anymore. And we see the result of that to her psychological well-being. Perfect. So when Joe is editing Norma's script, he cuts a scene of her at a slave market in her script, as he thinks there's too much of her in the storyline. So naturally, being quite self-absorbed, trying to make a script that's about her for her big great break, she gets upset. And I guess those fan letters become clear of their effect when she's using them as an argument, saying that all these fans are writing letters to her, when really it's not fans, it's just Max trying to protect her. So that is another example of Max feeding and heightening her delusions. So more photos of Norma are displayed throughout the house. It creates quite a claustrophobic and quite intense environment to be in when there are so many photos of this one person. And I guess it's kind of cemented when Joe and Norma watch a film of her in the living room, and it's one of Norma's old silent films. And I guess it reflects how she is stuck in that era still. There is a lot of evidence throughout the film, and in particular scenes that really cement the fact that she is trying to gain back the heights of her career. Coming back to that quote again. And I guess it's the metaphorical heights of her career. You might like to use that as a nice phrase. But Norma jumps up really quickly to point to herself on the screen when they're watching the film, which I kind of guess is almost childlike when you like point up and look at a screen. So that could be a note as well. Her psychosis is becoming more prevalent when she talks to herself and saying how she'll be a star again. Especially in this scene, there might be some nice quotes there. Not sure if they're in this presentation, but again, if you look up a PDF copy of the script, there are so many online that you can use Control F and look up those key quotes. Moving on, there's another high-angled camera shot. These are really common with Norma. Wilder uses them as a technique. We'll go through it a bit later to kind of support what I've said before about Norma being lesser, if that makes sense. Anyway, high-angled shot of Norma playing cards with the waxwork, so the other people during her era, with Joe sitting behind her, almost like a puppy dog. And Joe says he got her winnings, which added to about 70 cents. He notes that this was the only money he ever got from her. So he actually didn't get that cash. I think we know that Norma bought him clothes and things like that. I'll touch on that a bit in the later scenes. But he only ever got 70 cents, which is not what he was promised. Quick cash, yes. But I think we'd expect a bit more than that. So, yeah, I guess that's saying that he remains dependent when he's with her. So, moving on to the next scene, there's a sense of urgency throughout the sound of the flute as well. I'll get back to that a little bit. It kind of shows how Joe's finances are haunting him. And Max tries to help Joe when his car is found. So that's kind of the scene that this music is playing in. And he knows how Norma will handle the situation. So we do see a glimpse into Max's morality there, trying to help Joe, despite what Norma will think. He is trying to help Joe when his car is found. But Norma ignores Joe when he is in obvious need of her financially, and manipulates Joe in order for him to lose his autonomy, I guess, entirely. We do see it decrease a little more. But I guess this is a pretty key point when she denies his needs and takes him to the clothing shop. And Norma is wearing sunglasses inside, so I guess, again, symbolic of shielding herself from the outside world or the things that she's afraid of as well, and we'll touch a bit on that when looking at Norma's character in more detail as well. So Norma pays for Joe's very expensive and well-made clothes, and I guess this kind of symbolizes how he, again, financially depends on her, and Norma, again, trying to manipulate him. So there's a bit of a symbolic meaning behind that as well. Usually shoes, as a symbol, they kind of symbolize a standing point. So I'll go into it a bit more later, but shoes, and whether Joe is wearing them or not, or the type of shoes, I guess can represent his viewpoint or his clarity of thought throughout the film. But we'll touch on that a bit later when we're looking at some of the film techniques used. And just moving, I guess, to the garage where Joe was initially where he was initially staying when he was living with Norma. There was rain in the garage, which means it was ruined, and he had to move in officially to the mansion. So again, another sign of his autonomy weakening. There will be a few of these signs because we see it gradually decrease throughout the film. But it's also ironic that Jo will be sleeping in her former husband's room. And Norma's husband actually didn't share a bed with her as well, which is something to note. So, moving on to the next scene, Norma slaps Jo for not wanting to love her, essentially. So, we can see that dominance coming in there as well. And the reverse gender roles in their relationship. I'll touch more on that when we look at the themes. This is just a brief overview of the scenes. But, yeah, they're traditional gender roles in a relationship, especially during the 1950s. Norma and Jo are the complete opposite. So where Norma is strong and dominating, Jo is quite weak and submissive, which obviously oppose those traditional roles. But we'll tap more into that as well. So Artie talks to Jo about his coat, which is the one he didn't want in the shop, and Norma bought it for him anyways. And Jo very quickly changes the topic of conversation. So I think he's in denial about his situation with Norma, or he doesn't want to accept it and is quite embarrassed as well of the relationship that he has with her, or has begun to develop with her, because it was meant to be kind of a transaction relationship, you know, like, you write me a script, you pay me money, done. But I think that transactional relationship kind of develops or expands into that more personal level, but I still think it's transactional. They are still both wanting things from each other. It's not a relationship that forms off of love, really. And yeah, but there's also a close-up shot of Betty and Joe, and they are playing out a scene that they may potentially write. There is a lot in common between those two, and the closeness of them illuminates their attraction even more. So Betty as a whole is a foil character to Norma, or they juxtapose each other. They are opposing characters, in other words, especially for their personality as well. Especially, as I said, that Betty was kind of that clarity point. Norma definitely, I think, even upon first viewing, does not really take on the role of the clear thinker. She obviously is framed around her delusions and her aspirations, and that is very opposing to Betty, who still has ambitions but is more realistic as well and has a different approach to that than Norma. So Norma has also self-harmed and slit her wrists, and Joe cares enough for her that he does not want to be the reason that she ends her life. So we can see that he does care for her, but I think it still is on that kind of superficial level. It's not quite love, or the way that he learns to love Betty. It's not that type of attraction. There's also the dissolving shot of Joe at the party. This is the New Year's Eve party. And he actually takes a taxi to go back to the mansion. So he has given up his autonomy and his free choice for Norma to go back to the mansion. So New Year's Eve, just like as a general kind of symbol, if we're moving away from the film for a second, is kind of symbolic of a time of change and transition. You know, everybody celebrates a happy new year and you get all your New Year's resolutions ready to change. And if we're putting that in the context of the film, really there should be some sort of transition there for Joe as the protagonist, but he goes straight back to Norma after the New Year's Eve party. So we can see that it's kind of, he's not changing that much, essentially. So that could be a little something you include as well in your essays or your planning, maybe some background information. So kind of, I guess, looking at some techniques here, there is quite an optimistic sound that contrasts the situation they're in. It's almost a positive situation for Norma in the sense that she's been able to bring Joe back, even though she's hurt herself, so it's not realistically that positive. But he's come back to her. So I guess in that sense, it's a positive. And Max doesn't let Betty talk to Joe. He doesn't want Joe to leave. Not for Joe's sake, but again, Norma's protector. He's protecting her and wants the best for her if Joe makes her happy. There's a quote down here as well. I've never been happier in my life, in this last line here. If Norma is happy with Joe, then Max pretty much dictates, Joe stays. Betty cannot talk to Joe, essentially. And just as a bit of a symbol here as well, we'll tap into it again in a bit more detail, but the pool at the beginning of the film, obviously a bit past the introduction where Joe's floating in it, but it does start off when Joe arrives at the mansion as empty, and the pool is now filled up. So it kind of corresponds to Norma's mental state. When it's full, she's content and psychologically stable, I guess. And it's in this scene that Norma says, I've never been happier in my life. So I guess she's dependent on a companion to be happy, but it's also, I guess, symbolic of that pool as well, which is also a symbol for Joe and his ambitions, but we'll tap into that a bit later. Okay, so we find out that Hollywood want Norma to come back, but for her car. But Norma thinks that she's getting her big break, when in reality, she's not. But as a viewer, we know that, and we watch Norma kind of be very deluded by her ambitions, I guess. She's wanting that big break. Joe was writing that script for her, and she finally thinks it's happening, and realistically, it's actually not. And this is what I was talking about before with the gates. When she gets there, the security guard doesn't know who she is, and the gates are closed. So this symbolizes how she's never really going to be a part of the current Hollywood again. Gates are closed, can't go in, people don't recognize her. That all kind of just adds up together. So DeMille also reveals that Norma was a terror to work with towards the end of her career. And I guess there's some dramatic irony as well, as I said, that the audience knows why Gordon Cole called, which was for her car, but Norma thinks she's getting a big break. So I guess that's the technique you could use to associate that if you were going to talk about it in an essay context. And Hogeye turns the spotlight to Norma. This is when she's in Paramount Studios. She's close by to DeMille. Nobody's really recognizing her except for really only older people go up to her, as I was saying before. It's the attention she's been craving for. She's crowded by heaps of people, but they're not people who would be classified as current or into current things in the industry. So she lifts her arms up above her eye as well, but yeah, it's really important to note that only older people go up to her. There's no younger people going and crowding around her. Everybody who gives her the attention she's wanted is of that older generation. Norma cries quite melodramatically as she realizes how much she's missed Paramount Studios and the world that she's longed for a very long time. And DeMille says, just quite blankly, that her script will be an expensive production. So he's kind of sugarcoating it to her. Instead of saying that it's a bad script, he's quite sympathetic towards her, I guess, and her situation, and says that it's an expensive production, rather than saying no. But we do know that it's not going to really be produced. Joe sees Betty walking on the balcony of Paramount Studios as well, and he attempts to hide himself. So that's kind of symbolic of how he's embarrassed of his situation, I guess. So when Norma is leaving, DeMille places a kiss on her forehead, so he feels sorry for her. There's some more of that sympathy there as well. Perfect. And Norma believes that she will film Salome, so that's the script, which is symbolic, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this presentation. She believes that she'll film Salome with DeMille, tells Cole to forget about the car, feeling bad for her. So DeMille tells Cole to forget about the car because he doesn't want to feed her false hope, I guess, which is very much what she's thinking, that she'll get her big break, but unfortunately not. So Norma starts to think that Joe is seeing someone else. Joe denies the allegations, but he does go to see Betty, and they have quite a heartfelt conversation. She reveals that she got a nose job, and that she decided that she didn't want to try and fit in front of the camera, and that she thinks that being behind the camera is really more fun, which is a quote. I think might want to check my wording there. I'm sure I've included it a bit later. But the two essentially bond over some banter. So Joe innocently kisses her nose after she said she got a nose job. And the two share a nice moment together, which is very much a contrast to Joe's relationship with Norma. So there's those foil characters, or that juxtaposition coming in again. Perfect. So Max reveals to Joe that he was Norma's first husband. And Norma was excited that Joe returned from being with Betty, but then questions where he was. There is a dissolving shot into Joe and Betty typing together, which kind of allows the audience to sympathize with both Joe and Norma, and their circumstances. Joe wanting to kind of escape from feeling trapped, but Norma has finally found somebody that she thinks she can be with and trust. So there is an ability to sympathize with both parties there. Okay, so Betty realizes she loves Joe. Music suggests, like in the background, the score would be the formal technique, that their love can only lead to tragedy. So she's already engaged, essentially. It's not ethical in that sense. But nonetheless, Joe and Betty kiss, and it leads to a dissolving shot into Joe opening the gates of Norma's palazzo. Perfect. Norma is on the phone to Betty, questioning her, And I guess her machinations have gone far beyond just success. Now also about her relationship with Joe. She's there, so I guess her delusions have crossed from just being about her career, but also keeping Joe and not wanting him to go either. She's lost her career, doesn't want to lose Joe. But Joe grabs the phone from Norma, which is, I guess, a sign of him temporarily regaining his autonomy. Yay! It took the whole film, but he did it temporarily. We know how it ends, unfortunately, but that's kind of one of those signs I was talking about where we know what happens. It's inevitable that Joe dies, but there are moments like that where he does regain his autonomy, and we really hope that it will work out for him. But ultimately, we know his fate as a viewer. So Betty almost gives Joe an out. She encourages him to leave with her, and she covered her face as though she can't look at him anymore. Ultimately, because he decided not to. He wanted to protect Norma. But I guess she kind of misjudged him, thinking he would choose love over financial stability. But in reality, Joe actually did what he did to save Betty. So he did kind of choose love in that sense. Norma thinks he picked her over Betty. Joe attempts to pack up his suitcase, a sign of him trying to regain his autonomy once again. And he starts telling Norma a bunch of truths. So the truth about Paramount calling her about the car. Max doesn't accept or deny these claims because he obviously still wants to protect her. But because of this, Norma is kind of more encouraged to believe her delusions, that she's the greatest star of them all. As Max is not denying this, and she's had Max for a longer period of time than Joe. And Joe's telling her stuff that she doesn't want to hear, so we can see how she will definitely lean into Max's, not suggestions, but he's not accepting or denying the claims. So the flourishing score kind of builds up as the 2 shots have been fired that hit Joe in his stomach. And then it pretty much falls silent when when Norma shoots Joe for the last time in his back. I guess that last bullet is kind of symbolic of her really crossing that line between delusion and reality. Like, the line is so blurred at this point. And as we move to the famous closing scene where she's ready for her close-up, Norma is actually dressed in her Salome costume, so it's as if she's fully taken on the part of this character, which is why that script is so symbolic, and we will talk about it in a bit more depth than I have a bit later when we look at those symbols and motifs. But that is a nice summary. So this is just a nice 1-page summary to summarize everything I've just gone through. A lot of information, but hopefully you guys have watched the film by now. If you've done it for your first text response, I think your SAC would have already passed. But if you're doing it in second semester, then hopefully you still may have watched the film in the holidays. But as for a 1-page summary, Joe is struggling financially, led to Norma's mansion. She wants him to write a script so that she can make her return to Hollywood, wants her big break again, and he increasingly becomes more entangled into her delusions, loses his agency and autonomy, and he really needs that financial support. And Norma gives it to him to an extent, but when he really, really needs his car and things like that, she kind of manipulates it to keep him or stop him from leaving. So Norma becomes increasingly attached to Joe. As I said before, that chimp is very symbolic. He takes the place of the chimp that dies at the beginning of the film. And as we know, I guess Joe dies at the end as well. But we know he's already dead at the beginning. Perfect. So Norma gets a call from Paramount Studios, and she believes she's having a big break finally. But again, dramatic irony. We know why they're actually calling. They really just want her car. And Joe becomes closer to Betty. The two share a couple of intimate moments, which Norma begins to get suspicious of. And Joe tries to leave and break off his relationship with Norma. And we see that line blur between delusion and reality. Her delusions really transform into psychosis at this point, and she shoots him. And Norma dresses up in her Salome costume as she descends the staircase. The cameras flash, and she is, quote, ready for her close-up. The moment she has, ironically, unironically, longed for the entire film. wanting that moment with the cameras flashing. Perfect. So moving on to the interpretation of Sunset Boulevard. So this is just looking at some background information, I guess, looking at different periods and areas of Hollywood during the time where this film was directed by Billy Wilder, and also some background information as well. So we know it is of the film noir genre and was filmed in 1950s, in the 1950s period, by Billy Wilder. However, the film explores the different areas of Hollywood. So we kind of begin in that silent film era. As we know, Norma was a silent film star. But during 1911, 1926, silent movies used to be used improved technology, enabling them to be longer, edited, included minimal sounds, effects, and music. But really, the film was based on the faces and the expressions and the visual components rather than the dialogue. There was no dialogue. There were some text over, but no dialogue. The actors did not speak. We didn't need voices, we had faces. That's a quote from the film. Perfect. Moving on to the next era, the talkies of Hollywood. So Hollywood reinvented itself with The Jazz Singer. It was the first feature-length sound movie, but essentially the talkies are just when dialogue came into the mix. So all of a sudden, all those silent film actors and actresses who maybe didn't have the nicest speaking voice were all of a sudden not needed anymore, and a lot of them were treated, I guess, Norma as that wider representation of them, maybe a bit more dramatic in that sense, but she is kind of that symbol of those who were forgotten or who left the industry for that kind of reason, that they weren't needed anymore. And I guess that kind of showcases the how short-lived a career can be in Hollywood. It's not necessarily everlasting. I feel like as I said before, a lot of people, or especially in Sunset Boulevard, a lot of the characters are under the impression that once you enter Hollywood, that's it, you're there. And I think Wilder debunks that, as I said, and that fame is not necessarily everlasting. And I think that's kind of epitomized through the transition between the silent films and talkies. So that might be some nice authorial intent to include throughout your film, throughout your essay as well. Perfect. So, the golden age of Hollywood. Sunset Boulevard was produced during this time, 1950, and 70% of the American population went to the movies at least once a week. So, very, very popular. And yeah, this is when I guess Hollywood really started booming. So unfortunately for those silent film actors and actresses, missed out on the golden age, like Norma wanting to make her big break back. And then 1954 onwards was kind of the evolution of film. So the euphoria kind of ended quickly as a federal court case mandated competition and forced the studios to divest themselves of their theatre chains. So it's also post-war, and a television set was kind of introduced as well. There was a rise of pop culture, but by 1950, an estimated 10 million homes owned a television, so people didn't necessarily have to go to theatres anymore to see a movie or to watch a show or something. So I guess that is not the decline, but it was the beginning of the lessened popularity. Perfect. So, I guess what is Wilder's overall message? This could be interpreted in so many ways, but I guess just a nice brief overview one that I've kind of thought up here is through the exploration of the dangers of fame, gender constructs, and the concepts of fiction and reality. So there's some key themes there. Wilder sets out to paint his true image of Hollywood, highlighting his version of the deception of toxicity of the industry, whilst also using black comedy and film noir techniques to critique the industry's opportunism and illusion. So a lot to unpack there, but I guess that kind of sums up the overall authorial intent. There's a lot to pick up there, and there are different avenues that you could explore through that, but I guess as a whole, that could be one interpretation of it. Perfect. So moving on to character analysis. I hope my camera doesn't cut out too much here. But starting off with Joe Gillis, the narrator, presents himself kind of in an unflattering way. He seeks kind of commercial success rather than artistic merit. We see that Betty calls his scripts trite. He notes that he writes B-grade scripts. And yeah, so he's kind of lost that quality that maybe he begun with. That's more so implied. That's not directly stated that he started out really, really, really well. But I guess, you know, if you're striving to get into the industry, you're going to try your best to maybe once you're there, cut back a bit. Again, more so implied. But he's very self-aware, cynical, charismatic. There's some key, I guess, characteristics you can pick up from his dialogue. Very sarcastic as well. The bloodhounds were onto me, the debt collectors. So there are a few quotes there that you can use to showcase that as evidence. And I guess he could be classed as the anti-hero. So an anti-hero in a film is a central character in a story that lacks conventional heroic attributes. So, as I kind of mentioned at the start, Joe's morality is ambiguous, and it leaves viewers unsure of whether to trust his actions. And by that I mean there are some questionable moments by him, I guess, especially with Norma, but there are also some noble acts that he does, you know, trying to tell Norma the truth. And there are others, but I guess there are some main examples there. So, when thinking about characters, I guess some key things to help you if you get stuck in your essays, maybe you fall into summarizing the events. You can think about Joe's choices, goals, values, and trajectory, which is what we will be exploring. So, trajectory is kind of how only Joe, progresses throughout the film. So, Joe starts off with financial troubles, which led him to Norma. So, in order to reach success in Hollywood, Joe needed to stop lying to himself and those around him. So, Betty kind of makes him more aware of this throughout the film, but those trite stories are not as valuable as the meaningful material that he could potentially create. You know, I think Betty sees that potential in him, especially things in his past work. She finds that script which she thinks has potential. She wants to learn from him. And it takes her for him to see that again. But as he kind of develops that relationship with Norma, he slowly loses his autonomy throughout the film. So because of this relationship with Norma, I guess it kind of illuminates how much he was willing to sacrifice just for some cash in that financial situation. You know, he really, really, really lost a lot of power throughout the film, and his agency just kept weakening. His autonomy kept weakening. And he does attempt to take it back when the partnership between himself and Norma breaks. And we see him really try and do that. And I guess that's some of the heroic attributes that could link back to that morality kind of sense there. He's standing up for himself, finally. But in the final moments of the film, we see Joe and Betty working on one of his scripts, which, as I said before, quite an epochal moment, quite an epiphany for Joe. He realizes the worth behind his pieces and how he should be producing stories with quality rather than just those B-grade scripts. And he realizes the value compared to those small scripts that he used to write just to get by. Perfect. So, these are just some quotes that you could use in some certain circumstances. So, of course, there's more. You know, Joe spoke throughout most of the film. But these are just a couple that you might like to use. And you could also use film techniques as well, rather than dialogue. You can, of course, look at the dialogue, but there could be a high-angled shot or a low-angled camera shot. We'll look at some of the techniques as well for films, but you don't have to necessarily look at just quotes. You can use those techniques as evidence as well. Perfect. So, bloodhounds were onto me. I said that before. this is Joe referring to the debt collectors, and I guess if we're going to analyze this quote, it could be cast as kind of sardonic Lexis. So Lexis, I think you could use maybe a better term for that. That's more of a literary technique if you're doing a novel. Maybe rhetoric is a bit better, or dialogue or like expression. But essentially, in that sense, like rhetoric is just the tone of the rhetoric. So the sardonic rhetoric, the satirical, the cynical rhetoric. And Lexis, I guess, if you were doing a novel or if you're doing a book or a play with a script later in the year as well, or you've done it and you want to maybe use this technique for the exam, lexical choice or Lexis is just the choice of Lexis or the choice of words. But Wilder, as the director, did not choose the words. But the sardonic, I guess, rhetoric or the way that it's framed, the tone that it's framed in is something that the director can manipulate. So rather than analyzing the words, we can analyze the way that it's expressed. So I think rhetoric or expression or dialogue would be a better suit than Lexis in terms of analyzing a film. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, type them in the chat for me there. But yeah, feel free to use that technique if you're doing a novel or something else as well. Perfect. Okay, next quote. I snapped the hook and she snapped at it. So this is referring to Joe and Norma. So he's kind of saying that he's not the complete victim. You know, Norma had a part in it as well. So that's a nice quote to include as well. I don't qualify for the job anymore. That is Joe, I guess essentially saying he never officially loved Norma, but it's him recognizing that their relationship was toxic and transactional and that he doesn't want to be a part of their partnership or whatever it was anymore. So, next quote. She was a fool not to have sense there was something phony in my setup. This is a very key moment that kind of gives an insight into his morality and the ambiguity in that. That's not very moral, I guess, that sentence. She was a fool not to have sensed that I was phony, I guess. Maybe just don't be phony. But I guess that's a nice quote that highlights that insight into that anti-hero kind of character that Joe is. And he also refers to himself as the poor dope. So I guess this highlights his self-deprecating persona, or he mocks himself to an extent. He's quite cynical. He has quite a sarcastic, satirical, sardonic, cynical, whatever word you'd like to use to describe it, outlook on life. Perfect. So, Norma Desmond. So, from the outset, it is clear that Norma is quite obsessed with regaining her status and career that she held during the silent film era. And this very, very much defines her character throughout the film. So, throughout the whole film, all these delusions, all these ambitions, they're all framed around her getting her career back. There are maybe some side ones, like maybe trying to get Joe back and stuff, but that is the main thing that kind of defines her. But as a whole, if we're looking at the film noir genre, like Joe was the anti-hero, Norma can be defined as the femme fatale. So that is a character typical of a film noir genre, defined as an attractive or seductive woman, especially one who is likely to cause distress or disaster to a man who becomes involved with her. So Joe ended up dead, so I think there is some distress or disaster there as well. So we can see how she kind of fits under that term if we're looking at the wider definition of film noir. But similarly to Joe, if we want to develop characters, paragraphs or points of evidence on Norma, we can look at her trajectory. So, how she progressed as a character throughout the film. She has quite a lot of exaggerated movements and very exaggerated dialogue. And Wilder does this almost immediately, like the very first scenes that we see her. I am big, it's the pictures that got small. There's a lot to establish that, and it highlights her delusions immediately. It's Wilder's way of emphasizing that her thought process may not be as clear as a character like Betty. As I said, the clarity point, we can see how she might juxtapose Norma in that regard. But She then kind of moves to manipulate Joe for her own benefit, wants him to write a script for her comeback into Hollywood, even though he is kind of longing for a comeback in a sense as well. Maybe not as advertised as Norma's, but he is obviously in financial trouble and is trying to get out of it. But she very much sees it as one-sided. So I guess, as I said before, she uses him in the way that the industry did to her. Cool. So she breaks off the partnership. So immediately after, if she decides that she can't have Joe, then no one can. And this is a sign of her selfishness and the point where her delusions transform into a psychosis. And this relates, her trajectory very much relates to Salome's, or the character in her script, Salome, and we'll talk about that as well. But this is her trajectory, I guess, or how she moves as a character throughout the film. Perfect. So, quotes with Norma. I am big, it's the pictures that got small. Pretty famous one there. Highlights her self-aggrandizing persona, or self-aggrandizing, let's not use Lexis, we'll say something like self-aggrandizing rhetoric, dialogue, expression. If analyzing quotes in an essay, there's a technique for you as well. Rhetoric and expressions and things like that count as evidence, or analyzing the evidence. Of course, you may be too young to suspect of his sort. So talking to Betty, or talking down to Betty, really, implicitly having a higher status over her, or she's really trying to grasp at anything, any type of status, especially in a conversation with a very young woman new to Hollywood. And she's also, I guess, suspicious, and in during that conversation, of Betty's relations with Joe, so I guess she's establishing that higher status or dominating presence. So Joe notes Norma's house to be the kind, crazy movie people build, and I guess that's a foreshadow of the crazy movie person that lives inside, if we're talking in the language of Joe in that sense. But she was still sleepwalking along the giddy heights of a lost career. So there you go. That's a pretty good quote as well. As well as I'm ready for my close-up. Those two are nice. And quite universal. I feel like a lot of the quotes in these slides you can kind of transfer across topics in your essays. They're not looking too much at like specific moments. They're kind of framing Norma as a person, which means that you can kind of manipulate them to moments that you want to talk about. Obviously using them in context still, but yeah, not as specific. They can apply to more than one theme. For example, the heights of a lost career, that could refer to the dangers of fame. It could refer to the destruction of the Hollywood industry. It could refer to delusion. It could refer to ambition. It could refer to so many themes, and that's just off the top of my head. But it's one quote, so a lot of them are transferable in that way, I guess. Perfect. So, Betty Schaefer acts as a clarity point in the film. You will hear me say that, I'm sure, again and again. Because she is that new, young version that Norma, I think, wishes to be in a way. And she believes in the quality of scripts, which is a juxtaposition to Joe and his work, I guess. Because obviously before Betty got to him, he believed in those B-grade scripts. So in most other aspects, though, her character is a direct juxtaposition to Norma. So she juxtaposes Joe in the sense of his work and his work ethic and his ambitions, but as a character and her persona, Betty juxtaposes Norma as a whole, I guess, as a broad overview. But looking at Betty's trajectory, she starts off as a reader and has quite a low status in the business. So I guess it reflects those gender roles as well, women in the business. But she works with Joe to get experience as a writer. She wants to watch him and learn from him. And this is a direct display of her ambition to succeed. And it's a nice, mature, and clear approach to ambition as well. Joe wants to get some financial stability, but maybe his approach to it isn't as thought out as Betty's. Same with Norma, wants to regain her status, but there are some ways maybe that she could have gone about it better than hiding herself in a mansion or trying to get Joe to write her a script. That's a generalization there, but I'm sure you get the point. Perfect. So, some quotes for Betty. Life can be beautiful. This is very, very, very much a display of her optimistic persona and obviously a juxtaposition to Norma's outlook. There's a lot of juxtaposition with Betty, which is a good point in that sense to use in an essay. I just think the picture should say a little something. So this is juxtaposing Jo's attitude towards screenwriting and I guess her value for quality over quantity, or the B-grade scripts that Jo was writing. What's wrong with being on the other side of the camera? It's really more fun. So you can see there's kind of a mature approach to the industry there, and evading the toxicity and the standards that many don't or can't see until it's too late, like Norma or Jo. I like to write, just crystallizes her ambition, and I come from a picture family, just kind of ties into the industry a bit deeper. Perfect. So, Max von Merling, the last kind of character we'll look in great depth. So, as a whole, devoted to Norma's care. He is her protector, or views himself as her protector. But in shielding her from her the vital information and brutal facts, I think he fuels her delusions and enables her beliefs that she is still very much admired. So, a quote, "I made her a star, I cannot let her be destroyed." So, he is revealed to be Norma's first husband. His motivations for protecting her are out of love and devotion, yet they unfortunately have the opposite effect. She becomes much worse off, I think, with some of those actions that Max does. So, if we take a look at his trajectory, as a viewer, we see Max quite simply from the beginning taking the role of Norma's butler. He doesn't have a lot of dialogue as a whole throughout the film, but at the start of the film, it's really, really minimal, and it kind of increases as the film moves on. So this could be, like, depending on how you view it, it could be his protectiveness over Norma, or kind of his wariness of Jo and his intentions, just being cautious, I guess. And as the film progresses, his true intentions and motives are revealed. So, Wilder kind of employs a red herring throughout the film as well. So a red herring is kind of something in the plot that might lead the viewer into a false direction. Because at the beginning of the film, we don't know who's killed Jo. And there's a picture, maybe it's later, this picture here, which was used in advertising, which we can clearly see paints Max as quite, creeping up on Jo looking over his shoulder. We can see that maybe Max is painted as the villain, and definitely throughout the film as well, we can see that. But as the film progresses, we can kind of see his true intentions are just to protect Norma. But there is that kind of mystery element to him at the start, which can really emphasize that red herring. So that false kind of plot point. We think that maybe Max did it as we watched the film the first time, but really it was Norma. So that's that red herring there. And yeah, so writes the fan letters to Norma to keep her happy, and unfortunately this has the opposite effect. Okay, so these are just some quotes for Max here. Madame has moments of melancholy, referring to Norma. It's important to note that he often is not always referring to her as, he pretty much always refers to her as Madame. The only time that he refers to her as Norma is in that last scene when she's coming down for that close-up and he says Norma instead of Madame. So I guess that's a traditional kind of insight into the status. She never will, that's my job. That's referring to him protecting her from the truth. And I made her a star, I cannot let her be destroyed. There you go, there's some guilt there as well. Perfect, so now looking at the key themes. So, first up is the dangers of fame. So, the film as a whole works to offer, I guess, a critique into the toxicity of the industry. So, the illusion that many people are under throughout Sunset Boulevard and just in general, I guess, Wilder's insight into it. So, Norma's refusal to accept her fated career, I guess, is kind of that ideology that I've said before, how fame, is thought to be eternal or everlasting, and really it's not. It's quite short-lived in most cases because the industry progresses. We have that silent film era, the talkies, the golden age. There are different eras, and it's very, very hard to be relevant in all three of those, especially back then. And it also examines Hollywood's obsession with youth. So to make a big comeback, Norma attempted to make herself appear younger through her treatments, which is something we haven't talked about, is the ageism kind of throughout the film today. But she does go through those treatments, and I think Joe notes that there's nothing depressing about being 50 unless you're trying to be 25 or something like that, or something similar to that, which I guess is an insight into the dangers of fame and those really, really tough stereotypes to meet that really burden those people that are in front of the camera, rather than Betty, who's behind. She gets the notes to try and fit in, realizes maybe it's not for her, goes to behind the camera. Okay, so delusion versus reality. Perfect. So, this is seen kind of both within characters and the morality as well as the Hollywood industry. So within characters, there are characters who lie to themselves, like Joe and Norma. There are characters who lie to others, like Joe and Max, lying to Norma. And then Hollywood as a whole is an industry very much filled with delusion and an illusion, I think an overall illusion that fame is everlasting, or that, when you make it in Hollywood, that'll be it. And some people, like Betty, can see the reality, but I think this theme as a whole relates to Wilder's kind of overall authorial intent and that notion that fame is everlasting when really it's not. I told you I'd mention it a couple times today. Anyway, moving on to gender roles. So gender norms are explored throughout the characters and their relationships, primarily with each other. So Joe does not embody the typical 1950s American male traits in his relationship with Norma. I said this a bit before, but I guess expanding upon it, very, very submissive towards Norma and gets more and more submissive throughout their relationship. On the other hand, Norma does not embody the typical 1950s American female traits. She holds a lot of power in the relationship. She's quite manipulative over Joe. And that's a deliberate act done by Wilder and the scriptwriters of the film. So Norma also holds power over Max, and even in a way DeMille. They're both very, very sympathetic towards her and do things to kind of make her feel better in that way. So she does hold power over quite a few individuals. Betty was turned away from an on-screen role due to her nose. So this is, I guess, going into those gendered stereotypes and those beauty standards that are held on both women and men to an extent as well, especially when in front of the camera. So Betty moves to become a writer, and this is kind of, this symbolizes her escape from the toxicity of the industry, I guess. But however, not everybody can escape, like Norma and Joe. And that's just to name a few, I guess. Awesome. And film noir, very, very important technique, genre, theme that is really the overarching idea of the film. So there is a cynical, bleak tone that Wilder employs throughout the use of film noir techniques, or through the use of these techniques that fit under this genre. So in film noir, there are camera angles, like extreme close-ups, or maybe through a mirror, and this can kind of blur the line between illusion and reality, especially playing with lighting as well. So Norma's house is often quite dark, there are bars of light shining through, and the outside world is often presented as quite well lit. And Wilder often has characters lurking in the shadows to build uncertainty and suspense. So if we go back to this picture of Max kind of lurking in the shadows, we can see how he plays with lighting and height and how close people are to the camera as well, to kind of, I guess, show those values. Perfect. So flashbacks as well. The entire thing really is a recap. It's a flashback of how Joe, what led Joe to his demise. And that's what I said about that kind of sense of inevitability. We know what's going to happen, but the characters don't. And I guess there's some irony in that as well. There is quite a lot of irony in this film, so something that you might be able to pick out through quotes or certain scenes. But no matter how much we think a point in the plot will change the outcome, like Joe taking back his autonomy for a little moment, we know for a fact that Joe ends up dead because the entire film is a recount of what led to his death. So he will, no matter what, die at the end of that kind of recount, if you will. Perfect. So moving on to some language features. So this is a nice fancy one here, which I guess kind of uses light and shadow to create visual depth and contrasts. So this kind of falls under the subheading of lighting, but this is an example of it here, kind of using those shadows to create visual depth and contrasts, and definitely helps blur the line between illusion and reality, or idealism and cynicism, and Joe's moral ambiguity as well. There's also pathetic fallacy, which is the attribution of human feelings and responses to inanimate objects. So Norma's home represents the decaying and damaged woman within. The home is decaying and Norma is decaying. So I guess, to an extent, there is a pathetic fallacy there as well. Okay. Perfect. So this camera angles can kind of be used as a film noir kind of technique, but obviously they're used throughout different film genres as well. But a high camera angle, so this picture down here with Norma and Joe, I guess, is a film technique where the camera looks down at the subject from above. So can make the subject, like Norma, look quite small, and this could be both literary and metaphorically. So Wilder uses high camera angles with Norma a lot, and I think this kind of is a more implicit way of contrasting her self-aggrandizing persona. She builds herself up. I am big. It's the pictures that got small, but I think implicitly he kind of corrects that through things like a high camera angle, making her smaller than Joe in this scene, making her smaller than the viewers in this scene as well. So, and then on the other hand, we have a low camera angle. So pretty much the same opposite, the exact opposite, but when the camera looks up at the subject from below, making the subject appear larger. This could be metaphorically or, again, literal, but this kind of can instill more power and make them appear kind of scarier. So when we look at this one here, we can see that Joe is the narrator, so he is going to tell his story, I guess, but we are looking at him from below, which I guess is quite a, how would you say, it definitely captures the attention of the viewer straight away with that low camera angle, instead of looking above where you couldn't see his face. Perfect. So moving on to some symbols and motifs. There's quite a few here. But Salome, Norma's script, in summary, in a very, very brief summary, Salome loved a man, got rejected, killed him because she got rejected. Very brief summary, but it involves John the Baptist and stuff. It's definitely worth doing some research if you haven't already. There's a lot more depth to it, but in a nutshell, there are some discrepancies, but this kind of represents Norma and Joe. The same kind of thing happens. Norma loves a man, got rejected, or he walks out, killed him because she got rejected, and then she takes on that persona of Salome as she descends the staircase for her close-up. So that's why it's quite symbolic in that way. The pool as well, as I said before, it can represent Joe's success. He says, the poor dope finally got his pool, but the price to pay was higher. Buying a pool or getting a pool is quite something that people who are living comfortably can do. And obviously Joe was in quite financial, he had a lot of financial struggles, so a pool for him was a symbol of success. And he got the pool, but at what cost, I guess. But it can also represent Norma's mental state, as I said, empty at the beginning, and then it's full when she's never been happier with Joe. Perfect. And mirrors as well. So they are, or can be, a symbol of Norma's perception of reality. So she sees things how she wants them to be seen. And there are a couple of scenes where Wilder's playing with those mirrors, but I guess if you can view them in that context, there might be some useful essay points there. Perfect. So, the doors in the mansion have no locks. This is symbolic of the lack of barriers in their relationship between Norma and Joe. That one's pretty straightforward. But the tennis court as well. There is a sagging net and fading lines in Norma's mansion. Tennis court, and this is kind of symbolic of Joe's downfall as well. Perfect. So the chimp, as I've mentioned, can symbolize, or like monkeys in general can symbolize like a trickster, and how I guess this is how Norma and Joe kind of deceive each other, but obviously the chimp was also Norma's pet and Joe replaces that chimp. I've already kind of talked about that connection there. And Joe's shoes as well. Shoes can represent a standpoint or a viewpoint. When the debt collectors come, Joe actually isn't wearing any shoes, which emphasizes the lack of clarity. Compared to when Norma buys his shoes for him, we can see that he's kind of taken on her point of view, I guess. Or not point of view. They don't have a similar point of view, but standing in a different pair of shoes, I guess. Perfect. So, Joe's car as well, initially hidden, but a car is something usually shown off in Hollywood, and I guess it symbolizes how Joe hides his persona. The car is very much related to him, and when he loses the car, he loses a part of himself, I think. So that's that one. And the sunrise as well. So the film begins with a sunrise and ends with a sunset. Sunset can represent death, demise, or endings, which is also, unconventionally and ironically, when Joe dies. He dies at sunset. And the film begins with the sunrise. So there you go. Perfect. So last two, the mansion versus the apartment. So in Artie's apartment during the New Year's Eve party, it's a one-bedroom apartment, and it feels so roomy the way that Wilder has directed it and framed it in the screen, the frame of the movie film. Compared to Norma's mansion, I think. Quite claustrophobic with all those pictures of her as well. So I guess we can see that difference there as well. Even though it's a bigger house, a lot more claustrophobic and eerie. And the garage, Joe's imprisonment. The holes when it leaks symbolize the holes in Joe's psyche. So yeah, not much to talk about there with that one. Kind of pretty straightforward. Some of these symbols are more universal than others, like the Salome one. Some of these are quite specific, like the shoes or the tennis court and the garage. But they are useful maybe if you're doing another viewing of the film, which you should definitely before the exam anyway, regardless of whether you've done the SAC or not. But we can kind of see how they work together to form an essay point. Anyway, moving on to some different techniques. So score is the original soundtrack or music written to accompany a film. So this can kind of hint at something that's about to happen, or it partners some foreshadowing. So if the music's building up, maybe a dramatic moment's going to happen, like Norma shooting Joe, and maybe the music falling silent can symbolize something as well. And imagery. So the street name, Sunset Boulevard, is the opening of the film, but displayed in the gutter. Kind of already talked about this at the beginning, but it definitely establishes Miller's perspective on Hollywood, which is in the gutter. And that's pretty much immediately as well. And it's a street associated with wealth, and it's definitely an affluent street. And I think it just partners a much more underlying darkness as well to the industry. Perfect. So moving on to an essay structure or an essay plan. So You can pause this and read this as you like, but this is kind of a nice guide or what you can include in your essay and your different components to the essay. So there's that one. And I think it's just really important to know, I want to emphasize how important it is. I might touch on this a bit more, but planning is super, super important. If you don't plan, you're really, 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 I think, costing yourself, especially on the exam. It's so important to clarify your thoughts and your arguments, especially when under SAT conditions and having to write an essay in an hour, or in exam conditions as well. So this is an example one for Sunset Boulevard. You can pause to read this, but it has a really strong contention, and these points address the topic or the components of the topic, as well as offering that kind of new insight or that counter argument in the third paragraph. That rebuttal, which is super, super important, needs to stay within the parameters of the question, but really important to kind of add to that complexity of your interpretation of the prompt. That's what you're getting marked on in the text response, don't forget, is the complexity in your interpretation of the topic that you choose to write on. But yeah, in relation to this, your introduction should really outline the key points or topic sentences that are in your body paragraph, those key arguments, and there should be no new information in the conclusion, if we're talking about that. And your body paragraph should have a clear prose and clear points of argument. Want to aim for 2 examples in your body paragraphs, because if you're making an argument, which is what your body paragraph is, you're arguing that Sunset Boulevard is looking at opportunism, or in this case, Sunset Boulevard, Wilder offers a cautionary tale upon the exploitative nature of Hollywood's deception. If that's what you're arguing, then an argument with 2 points of evidence or points in the film is stronger than 1. Think of it that way. Having 2 examples is stronger than 1 when you're arguing something. So important to think of 2 moments or 2 characters, or however you want to organize your paragraphs. Try and aim for 2. Discussion of at least 2 characters. There you go. Perfect. So here's, I guess, a sample kind of outline. Sunset Boulevard is a satire of an industry built on illusion and opportunism. Discuss. So this is just something that I've pulled together. Feel free to pause and read it, but a contention I've developed when looking at this topic. Whilst Sunset Boulevard does satirically explore the illusion and opportunism of Hollywood, Wilder also navigates through one's ability to overcome the toxicity of the industry. So I'm not focusing too much on how to form these ideas in this presentation. We do have some other lectures and some PowerPoints and resources at ATAR Notes that support that, or that can help you with that. This is more so looking at the structure of ideas for this topic for Sunset Boulevard, or to give you an idea of what to talk about as well. So I guess some key points that I talked about here. I talked about in the prompt, it highlights that Sunset Boulevard is a satire, so that Wilder mocks the illusion or the illusory nature of Hollywood. That's my first point. I'm looking at the illusion and satirical component of the topic. And then my second point is looking at the satirical approach to opportunism, which again directly addresses the prompt. And my third and final point is that counter argument, which I guess is saying that, there are people who can overcome the toxicity of the industry, or can overcome the illusion and opportunism, like Betty, for example. And there's my counter argument there. So if you have any questions on that, that was a very brief overview, not too much detail going into the construction of that. Any questions? Feel free to type it in the chat. But as a whole, I hope that you guys enjoyed this lecture. I find it helpful. Hopefully you can take away some components and include them in your essays. But thank you so much for coming along today. As I said, feel free to type any questions in the chat. But yeah, I hope it was helpful for you guys.